They found her where the mountains folded in on themselves, where the trees grew so close together that daylight arrived only in thin, trembling strips. The Harper woman had not been seen in 30 years, not since the summer her name was whispered once and then sealed shut like a grave that no one wanted to tend. To most, she was already dead. To the mountains, she had never left. The first photograph of her after all those years showed a face carved by time and solitude, eyes pale but unafraid, staring straight into the lens as if daring the world to remember what it had tried so hard to forget. Her hair hung long and grey, tangled like roots pulled from the earth. She did not look rescued. She looked discovered. Appalachia has a way of keeping secrets. The hills remember footsteps long after bodies are gone, and the wind carries stories that never quite settle. When word spread that the Harper woman was alive, old men fell silent on porches, and women who had never met her crossed themselves without knowing why. Some said she had gone mad and fled into the woods. Others said she had been cursed. No one said she might have been right. She spoke little at first. She didn't ask about the town or the people who once knew her. What she asked for were her journals. When they were brought to her, bound in cracked leather and stained with decades of damp earth, her hands trembled not with fear, but with purpose. Those pages held something she had carried alone for 30 years, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally have ears willing to hear it. As news crews gathered and officials prepared their statements, they believed they were closing a mystery. They didn't yet understand they were opening a wound. Because the Harper woman had not survived the mountains by accident. She had stayed hidden for a reason. And what she was about to reveal would not just explain her disappearance, it would expose why an entire town had needed her gone in the first place. The hiker had not planned to go that far off the trail. He later said the path seemed to pull him, narrowing until it became less of a trail and more of a suggestion pressed into the forest floor by memory rather than feet. The air grew colder the deeper he went, heavy with the smell of wet leaves and old wood, and the trees leaned inward as if listening. When he noticed the silence, it was already too late to turn back comfortably, because the usual sounds of birds and insects had thinned into something watchful, something restrained. That was when he saw the cabin. At first, it looked like a ruin, the kind hikers sometimes photograph and forget. The roof sagged under decades of moss, and one wall leaned slightly as though exhausted by standing so long. But the door was closed, not warped open like most abandoned structures, and a thin trail of smoke lifted from a stone chimney, barely visible against the grey sky. He stood there longer than he meant to, convincing himself there was a reasonable explanation, perhaps another hiker, perhaps a hunter, though hunting season had ended weeks earlier. Curiosity won over caution. As he stepped closer, the ground around the cabin told a different story than the walls. The leaves had been disturbed recently, pressed down by careful footsteps, not scattered by animals. A stack of split firewood rested beside the porch, the cuts clean and recent, sap still pale against the bark. Someone had swept the porch with a pine branch, pushing dirt into neat lines that rain had not yet erased. The hiker called out, his voice sounding wrong in that place, too modern, too loud. No answer came, but something shifted inside the cabin, a soft scrape followed by stillness. His skin prickled. Through a grimy window, he saw the outline of a table, a kettle resting atop a small iron stove, and beside it, a chair pulled back as if its owner had just stood up. The kettle was warm when he touched it, heat lingering in the metal like a held breath. That was when unease settled fully into his chest. Abandoned places did not feel like this. They did not feel paused. Near the back of the cabin, half hidden under a rock, lay a pair of worn boots positioned carefully side by side, their soles muddy, their laces freshly tied. He realized then that whoever lived here did not want to be found, only passed by unnoticed, folded into the mountain's countless other forgotten shapes, waiting just beyond sight as the forest closed itself again around the cabin and the secret it had been keeping for 30 years. News of the cabin traveled faster than the hiker expected, carried from a park ranger's report to a local sheriff's desk, and then outward into the small towns stitched along the ridges. At first, it was treated as little more than an oddity, another strange thing the mountains occasionally offered up, but that changed when an older deputy, sorting through archived records late into the night, noticed a familiar description buried in a faded incident report. The location, the age of the structure, The way it sat far from any mapped homestead stirred something uneasy in his memory. Boxes of old files were pulled from storage, their cardboard soft with age and their labels written in careful handwriting that no one used anymore. Inside them were yellowed flyers, curled at the edges, each bearing the same black and white photograph of a woman staring slightly past the camera. The name Harper appeared beneath the image, followed by a date 3 decades old and a promise of reward that had long since expired. The deputy felt a tightening in his chest as he laid the flyers across the desk, aligning them with the new photographs taken at the cabin. The resemblance was undeniable, not just in the structure's location but in the quiet, deliberate way it had been hidden. When the flyers were shared with the sheriff, the mood in the office shifted. What had been a curiosity hardened into something more serious, more fragile. The Harper woman had been one of those disappearances that never sat right, quietly shelved rather than solved. There had been no body, no struggle, just a woman who stepped out of her life and into absence. Over the years, her name had become something people avoided saying aloud, as if it carried a weight that could still bruise. The resurfacing of her image triggered a reaction far beyond the station. Local newspapers reprinted the flyer, this time beside a grainy photograph of the cabin's doorway. Social media filled with scanned clippings and fragments of memory, people claiming they remembered her voice, her walk, the way she never looked anyone in the eye for too long. With each shared image, the past crept closer, refusing to stay buried. What unsettled the authorities most was not that she might be alive, but how neatly the cabin fit into gaps that had never been explained. Search parties decades earlier had combed the area in wide, careless circles, trusting maps instead of instinct. No one had looked where the land turned inward, where trails dissolved and compasses faltered. The realization settled slowly and uncomfortably that she might have been there all along, watching the searches pass at a distance, choosing silence over discovery. As the flyers spread, reactions split sharply. Some expressed relief, others disbelief, but a few responded with immediate hostility, insisting the past should remain untouched. That resistance only sharpened suspicion, suggesting the disappearance had never been just about a woman who wandered away, but about something the community had agreed, without ever speaking it, to forget, until the cabin and those faded flyers dragged the Harper woman's name back into the light where it could no longer be ignored. The reaction in the towns nearest the mountains was not what outsiders expected. There were no candlelight vigils, no quiet prayers of thanks whispered on front porches. Instead, a strange tension settled over the community, thick and brittle, as if the air itself were bracing for impact. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar cars passed by. Doors closed earlier than usual. When people spoke of the Harper woman at all, they did so in lowered voices, glancing around as though the hills might be listening. Older residents responded with a practiced discomfort, the kind that comes from long years of holding something down. Some dismissed the news outright, claiming it was a mistake or a cruel hoax, their laughter sharp and too quick. Others grew defensive, insisting that whatever had happened back then had already been dealt with, that digging into it now would only cause harm. There was an urgency to their objections that felt less like concern and more like fear, though few were willing to name it. Younger generations sensed the shift without fully understanding it. They noticed how their parents stiffened at the mention of her name, how grandparents refused to answer simple questions. A woman at a diner dropped a plate when she heard the news on the radio, the crash echoing through the room in a way that drew too much attention. No one helped her clean it up. They just watched, silent, as if waiting for something worse to follow. Rumors surfaced quickly, not of her suffering, but of her danger. People claimed she had always been strange, that she had invited trouble, that the mountains had taken her for a reason. These stories were offered like shields, excuses polished by repetition. It was easier to paint her as something other than a victim, easier to believe that her disappearance had been necessary rather than unjust. What unsettled investigators most was how often relief appeared beneath the fear. Several locals admitted, with careful phrasing, that life had become quieter after she vanished. Arguments had stopped. Certain men had moved on. Certain questions had never been asked again. The absence had brought a kind of order, fragile but comfortable, and the thought of her return threatened to break it open. Even among those who claimed to feel sympathy, there was an unspoken boundary they would not cross. They wished her well, they said, but from a distance. They hoped she would be cared for somewhere else, anywhere else. Bringing her back into the town's daily life felt to them like reopening a wound they had built their identities around pretending did not exist. The collective unease revealed something darker than hostility. It suggested that her disappearance had served a purpose, one that many had benefited from and none wanted examined too closely. The Harper woman had not simply gone missing, she had been removed from the story the town told about itself, and now that story was unraveling, thread by thread, under the weight of a truth the community had spent 30 years teaching itself not to see. When they finally approached the cabin with intention rather than accident, they expected resistance, confusion, perhaps even panic. What they encountered instead was composure that felt almost unsettling. The woman who opened the door stood straight despite her age, her frame thin but steady, eyes sharp in a face worn by weather and years of isolation. She did not ask who they were. She did not ask why they had come. It was as if she had been waiting, not in hope or fear, but in certainty. Up close, the signs of time were unmistakable. Her hands were knotted with age, her skin marked by scars whose stories had long since lost witnesses. Yet her gaze never wavered, never clouded. She spoke clearly, choosing her words with care, and corrected them when they assumed confusion or frailty. The mountains had taken their toll on her body, but they had not dulled her mind. If anything, solitude had sharpened it, carving her thoughts into something precise and deliberate. Inside the cabin, life revealed itself in quiet order. Shelves were lined with jars of preserved food, each labeled in careful script. Tools were cleaned and arranged with ritual consistency. Near the hearth lay a stack of journals wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture with a level of foresight that spoke of long planning. She noticed their eyes drawn to them and gently placed a hand over the bundle, not possessively, but with a gravity that made it clear those pages were not yet meant to be opened. They asked how she had survived, how she had avoided detection for so long. She answered simply, saying the mountain provided when respected, and hid those who learned how to disappear within it. There was no bitterness in her voice when she spoke of the years gone by, no lament for the life she might have lived. That absence of regret unsettled them more than anger ever could have. It suggested choice rather than exile. As they prepared to escort her down the mountain, she paused at the doorway and looked back at the cabin, her expression unreadable. This place, built from rough wood and patience, had been both shelter and sentence. She touched the doorframe once, a gesture more like acknowledgement than farewell. Then she turned toward the waiting vehicles without hesitation. On the drive away, she watched the trees slide past with a calm that contrasted sharply with the tension inside the car. When asked if she was afraid of returning to the world she had left, she shook her head. Fear, she said, belonged to those who had something to hide. She had carried her truth alone for 30 years, keeping it alive in ink and memory, waiting for the moment when her silence would no longer be necessary, and the world would finally be forced to listen. In the days following her return, officials moved quickly to frame a narrative that felt familiar and manageable. They spoke of trauma, of a woman overwhelmed by circumstances who had retreated into the wilderness to escape a life that had broken her. The language was careful and sympathetic, designed to settle nerves and close questions before they could sharpen. To the outside world, it was a simple story of survival and resilience, one that required no deeper examination of what had driven her into the mountains in the first place. Yet small inconsistencies began to surface almost immediately. Records showed no history of abuse reported by her, no documented threats, no financial trail suggesting she had planned to disappear. Neighbors interviewed decades earlier had described her as cautious but stable, reserved but not fragile. The official explanation did not align with the woman they now met, whose mind was clear, whose memory was precise, and whose composure suggested long intention rather than sudden flight. When questioned privately, she did not confirm the assumptions being made on her behalf. She listened, eyes steady, as if allowing them to speak themselves into error. When she finally responded, her answers were brief and carefully limited, correcting details without offering replacements. She did not deny that she had chosen to leave. She did not affirm that she had been running from harm. The space between what she said and what she refused to say grew increasingly uncomfortable for those tasked with telling her story. Investigators noticed that certain names never appeared in the official summaries, despite recurring in old witness statements. Interviews that had once seemed irrelevant now carried an odd weight, especially those involving people who had since gained influence or respect within the community. The more the authorities attempted to smooth the narrative, the more it resisted coherence, like a puzzle assembled with pieces from different boxes. Medical evaluations further complicated matters. She showed no signs of delusion, no cognitive decline that could explain 30 years of isolation as confusion or fear. Instead, doctors noted an unusual emotional control, a measured restraint that hinted at long practice. She answered questions as though they were negotiations rather than examinations, offering just enough to satisfy without revealing leverage. Behind closed doors, some officials began to suspect that the accepted explanation was not just incomplete but intentionally misleading. It was easier, safer, to believe she had fled a personal nightmare than to consider that her disappearance had been connected to something larger, something involving others who still lived freely in the open. Reframing her as a victim of her own fragility protected more than her dignity. It shielded the town from scrutiny. As press statements continued to circulate, the gap between public perception and private doubt widened. The Harper woman watched it unfold without comment, allowing the story to settle into place like a mask. Those who looked closely could sense that it did not fit, that beneath it lay another truth entirely, one she was not yet ready to release, but which pressed steadily against the surface, threatening to crack the narrative the moment she chose to speak. When she finally agreed to allow portions of her journals to be read, it was not to investigators or reporters, but to a quiet archivist from a nearby university, someone she had requested by name after reading an article clipped and saved years earlier. The journals themselves were heavy, swollen with age, their pages warped from damp air despite the oilcloth wrapping. Inside, the handwriting was steady and disciplined, changing little over decades, as if consistency itself had been a form of survival. What emerged from those pages was not a tale of escape, but of responsibility. She wrote of a summer when the town stood on the edge of collapse, though few realized it at the time. A crime had been committed that threatened to pull several families into ruin, men whose names carried weight, whose livelihoods shaped the valley's economy and politics. The truth, if spoken aloud, would have destroyed more than reputations. It would have left children without fathers, workers without wages, and a community already struggling pushed into something worse. She had been there when it happened, not as a perpetrator, but as a witness no one expected. Her journals described the pressure that followed, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Doors closing. Warnings framed as advice. Silence offered as protection. She realized quickly that justice, as the town understood it, was negotiable, and that someone would need to carry the cost of that negotiation. When she refused to lie outright, a different solution formed around her, one that required no official action, only collective agreement. She would disappear, and with her, the danger of exposure. What startled the archivist most was her insistence that she had chosen the mountains. The journals made it clear that she believed someone had to remain outside the lie for it to hold. By removing herself, she preserved the evidence without triggering its consequences. From the cabin, she documented changes in the town, noting marriages, deaths, promotions, all traced carefully back to the event that had set everything in motion. She became, in effect, the keeper of a truth that could not yet survive daylight. She also wrote of protection, of moments when her silence prevented violence or retaliation. There were nights when she watched search parties from a distance, understanding that being found too soon would force a reckoning the town was not prepared to face. The journals framed her isolation not as punishment, but as containment, a way to keep a buried crime from poisoning everything around it until the right moment arrived. As the archivist read on, it became clear that the Harper woman had not been hiding from the world, but holding it at bay, absorbing the weight of a secret so that others could continue living unbroken lives, trusting that one day the truth would be strong enough to stand on its own without destroying everything it touched. As the contents of the journals were cross-checked against public records, one pattern emerged with unsettling clarity. The truth she had guarded did not point toward nameless wrongdoing, but toward a family whose name had become almost synonymous with stability and respect in the region. They were spoken of in town meetings and church sermons as examples of perseverance, their success woven into the local identity so tightly that questioning it felt like questioning the land itself. Yet the journals traced their rise with careful precision, marking the moment when their influence accelerated in the years following her disappearance. What made the implication so disturbing was not just the accusation, but its plausibility. Financial records showed a sudden consolidation of property during the same period she vanished. Court documents revealed charges quietly dropped, investigations redirected, witnesses who had changed their statements or moved away entirely. Each individual detail might have been dismissed on its own, but together they formed a shadowed outline that matched the events she described with uncomfortable accuracy. When officials reached out to members of the family, the response was swift and polished. Lawyers appeared before questions could fully form, statements emphasizing cooperation while offering no substance. Publicly, the family expressed sympathy for the Harper woman's ordeal, praising her resilience while gently reinforcing the idea that trauma can distort memory. The strategy was subtle but effective, planting doubt without appearing cruel, protecting the image they had spent decades cultivating. Privately, the tension escalated. Investigators reported missing files, altered logs, and a resistance to reopening cases that bordered on obstruction. Long-retired officials declined interviews, citing health or faulty recollection, though their names appeared repeatedly in the margins of her journals. The more pressure applied, the more it became clear that the family's reach extended beyond business into the machinery of local authority itself. The community's reaction was deeply divided. Some refused outright to believe the implication, viewing it as an attack on the town's honor. Others, especially those who had long lived at the margins, expressed grim recognition, recalling moments when certain rules had never seemed to apply equally. The Harper woman's testimony forced people to confront disparities they had normalized, benefits enjoyed by some at the quiet expense of others. What lent her words their greatest weight was the absence of bitterness. The journals did not seek revenge or exposure for its own sake. They documented cause and effect, responsibility and consequence, with a restraint that made denial increasingly difficult. She had not named the family to destroy them, but because the truth could not exist without names attached to it. As evidence accumulated, the family's legacy began to fracture, not in dramatic collapse, but in fine, spreading cracks. Plaques and honors that once felt unquestionable now seemed fragile, their meanings shifting under scrutiny. The Harper woman's long silence had allowed the family's reputation to grow unchallenged, but her return transformed that silence into a lens, forcing the town to see how respectability had been built atop omission, and how much effort had gone into ensuring that certain truths never learned to speak aloud. Once the implication of powerful names became impossible to ignore, something began to loosen in the town's collective restraint. It did not happen all at once, nor did it come with dramatic declarations. Instead, it arrived in small, hesitant admissions, offered in private rooms and quiet corners, as though speaking the truth still required protection from being overheard. People who had spent decades perfecting silence found themselves unable to maintain it now that the woman they had outlived had returned to claim her place in the story. The first confessions were cautious and incomplete. A former clerk admitted to altering a date on a document after being told it was for the greater good. An old neighbor acknowledged hearing raised voices the night everything changed, then convincing herself it was none of her concern. Each statement seemed minor on its own, yet together they began to fill the empty spaces her journals had outlined so precisely. The fear that had once kept these people quiet was still present, but it was now tempered by the realization that the truth no longer rested on one person's shoulders. As word spread that others were coming forward, more followed. Some were driven by guilt, others by self-preservation, sensing that continued silence might soon carry consequences of its own. A retired deputy broke down during an interview, admitting he had been ordered to redirect a search away from a particular ravine, an order he had followed without question. A local contractor revealed he had been paid to repair damage at a property tied to the implicated family, told to forget what he had seen and grateful at the time for the work. What changed the tone of these confessions was not their content, but their timing. For years, these same individuals had dismissed the Harper woman as unstable or irrelevant. Now, faced with the undeniable consistency between her account and emerging testimony, they began to speak of her with a reluctant respect. They acknowledged, sometimes haltingly, that her disappearance had made their own lives easier, and that they had accepted that convenience without examining its cost. The process was not without resistance. Some retracted statements under pressure. Others spoke only through intermediaries, fearful of backlash. Yet the pattern held. Each new confession reduced the power of the old lie, making it harder for anyone to claim ignorance. The weight shifted from one woman's words to a chorus of corroboration, fragile but growing. For the Harper woman, these admissions were neither vindication nor relief. She listened without comment, her expression unchanged, as though she had anticipated every detail. The confessions did not surprise her, they confirmed what she had lived with for 30 years. What mattered was not that people were finally speaking, but that they could do so without destroying one another in the process. The truth, once too dangerous to survive in the open, was learning how to move through the town again, carried by many voices instead of one, making it impossible to bury a second time. The moment she chose to speak publicly, the atmosphere in the town shifted as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Crowds gathered cautiously at the old community hall, reporters jostling for position, local residents clustering in the back, some with faces pale from anticipation, others flushed with anger or shame. Cameras recorded every movement, every glance, but she seemed unaware of them, focused entirely on the people who had once shaped the story she had carried alone. When she began, her voice was calm and deliberate, each word measured with care, carrying the authority of someone who had watched decades pass from the quiet distance of the mountains. She did not frame her testimony in accusation or outrage. Instead, she recounted events with a precision that left no room for doubt, connecting threads that had long been ignored, overlooked, or actively suppressed. Names, dates, actions all were stated plainly, without embellishment, yet their weight was undeniable. For those implicated, it was a reckoning long delayed. For the community, it was as if the very air had been turned inside out, exposing corners of life and history that had been hidden under layers of habit, convenience, and fear. The hall was silent except for her voice, though beneath the quiet, tension pulsed like electricity. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away, some clutching hands, others unable to stop staring. Each revelation chipped away at carefully maintained reputations, unraveling narratives that had been assumed immutable. The power structures that had gone unquestioned for decades began to wobble, the veneer of respectability cracking under the illumination of her words. Some resisted, of course, interrupting with murmurs or rolling eyes, clinging to denial, or attempting to reframe her testimony as distorted memory. But her credibility was rooted not in anger or spectacle, but in the meticulous record she had kept, the decades of observation and documentation that could not be easily dismissed. Every fact she cited, every subtle pattern she traced, was backed by evidence, cross-referenced against records, photographs, and the confessions that had quietly surfaced in the weeks leading up to this moment. As she continued, it became clear that she had carried a dual burden, the weight of the secret itself and the responsibility to release it in a way that minimized unnecessary harm while ensuring truth could no longer be avoided. By the time she concluded, the hall was charged with a strange mixture of awe, fear, and understanding. Her role as a silent guardian had transformed into that of a witness who could no longer remain invisible. Her final words did not plead for forgiveness or recognition. They simply stated the facts, leaving the audience to confront them, to grapple with their implications, and to reckon with how long they had allowed silence to dictate their lives. What had been hidden for 30 years now stood exposed, forcing the town to confront a reality they had managed to ignore for generations, a truth that would redefine not just her legacy, but the very history they had believed to be unshakable. By the time she left the podium, the transformation of the town's collective memory had already begun. What had once been whispered rumors, selective recollections, and convenient silences was now codified into an undeniable narrative. The Harper woman's words had done more than expose wrongdoing, they had forced a community to reckon with decades of avoidance, reshaping how people understood the events that had shaped their lives. Streets, homes, and workplaces carried a different weight now, every familiar corner tinted with the knowledge that much of what had been accepted as truth had been carefully curated, polished, and in some cases, deliberately obscured. Her legacy shifted from that of a vanished recluse to something far more complex and powerful. No longer could she be dismissed as merely eccentric or tragic. The act of surviving, of observing, of recording, and finally revealing the truth positioned her as the linchpin in a story that encompassed secrecy, power, and moral responsibility. Where once her disappearance had left a gap, a silence, her re-emergence filled that space with clarity, forcing even the most resistant residents to reconsider their assumptions about morality, loyalty, and courage. Families once shielded by her absence felt the tremors of accountability. The reputations they had built on careful omission and strategic silence began to erode under public scrutiny, not with vengeance, but through the quiet authority of verified truth. The Harper woman's meticulous documentation left little room for denial, leaving those implicated to face both their past actions and the consequences of having benefited from her prolonged silence. The mountain, which had hidden her so effectively, had become the foundation for her testimony, a symbol of endurance and insight that no official report could replicate. At the same time, ordinary residents found themselves re-evaluating their own roles in the town's history. Complicity, ignorance, and passive acceptance had long been normalized, but now they were measured against an active witness who had endured in solitude to protect and reveal. Her return prompted reflection, apology, and in some cases, acts of restitution. The town could no longer pretend that its collective conscience had been intact. They had been participants in a system that required omission and quiet compliance, and the Harper woman's emergence made those choices visible. Even after she departed for the last time, the influence of her testimony lingered, shaping conversations, influencing decisions, and altering the way future generations would perceive the past. Textbooks, local histories, and oral traditions had to be rewritten, reframed around her actions and observations. She had not simply returned, she had rewritten the narrative itself, transforming it from a story of disappearance and mystery into a story of vigilance, courage, and moral reckoning. Her legacy, once shrouded in fear and conjecture, had been reclaimed as one of deliberate guardianship. In exposing the truth, she had changed not only how she would be remembered but how the community would understand itself for decades to come, ensuring that the events she endured would never again be buried in silence.